All right, today, guys, we are going to be reviewing both World War II and the Cold War for our STAR EOC. We're starting on slide 2 of our packet for today, and my screen may look a little different than yours. I set up some little drag and drops just so that there's a little bit less typing on my end and more talking as I am instructing y'all. So we are going to focus on the types of governments that were found in the key players of World War II and define those types of governments. So first up is democracy. Drag this one over here. This is a government by the people or rule by the majority. You should be pretty familiar with this. This is the form of government we have here in the United States. Communism, we also talked a lot about. So hopefully that one also sounds a little familiar to you. Communism comes from the words common or universal, and it is not just a form of government, but also a complete social, political, and economic ideology that supports a state. So it's the movement within those goals for structured ownership. The key in communism is we comes before me, that you are doing all of your efforts, all of your works for the benefit of the state, and then the state is going to take care of you. And that usually works pretty well on paper, but it is hard to find good examples of that working in reality. Our example of that during World War II is the Soviet Union. And I put Russia in parentheses just to remind you that when the Soviet Union converts to communism, or when Russia converts to communism, we call it the Soviet Union. So to be accurate, that's what we're talking about here. And of course, it's going to be the clash between these two. The Cold War begins after. These are the reasons we disagree post-World War. So those tensions are there underlying during World War II. Next up is fascism. And so for fascism, we are looking for authoritarian and nationalistic. This is Italy. This is Mussolini in Italy. He is a fascist leader. Nazism is the political party, of course, founded by Adolf Hitler. National Socialism associated with the Nazi Party, and of course, one of their central ideas would be the anti-Semitism or anti-Jewish ideologies. This is Germany under Adolf Hitler. Totalitarian is a broader concept. If you look at the root word total, a totalitarian government is a government that has complete or total control over all aspects of society. And so Nazism and fascism are both examples of a totalitarian government. It's just a broader concept, and then Nazi and fascist would be examples of that. Militarism, we see this in Japan during World War II. It's when the military has total control of society. And then our final term is nationalism. This belief that one's nation is superior to others. You have people who share a history, a culture, or common language, but it is this deep, intense pride in your country, that your country and the best is the best. And then, of course, the way that you prove your country is the best is you have to defeat another country or expand your boundaries and become bigger than another country. And so this naturally is going to lead to these conflicts that we see that cause World War II. Examples of nationalism would be all of these countries, including the United States. We still have good examples of nationalism when we say the pledge or play the national anthem. Those are components of nationalism.
And Hollywood kind of like popped out at your hips and they go skinny down at the bottom, like MC Hammer pants. Yeah, those were funny. Anyway, I'm sure we look back at those pictures.
All right, the next two slides are covering the key vocabulary terms, key people, events, all of that good stuff from World War II. Now, slides 3 and 4, any of these terms, they are all fair game to show up on the STAR test. So make sure that you are familiar with all of them. However, there are some that we want to emphasize that tend to show up a little more often than others. We're going to start with the Lend-Lease Act up here. And so if you look at the Lend-Lease Act, this begins before the United States enters the war. And this is significant because it pulls USA out of the Great Depression. So when we began selling, leasing, lending war materials to countries like Britain and France or any other country that the United States felt like it needed to lend weapons to, that kickstarts the U.S. industry. All the factories have a purpose again to produce these wartime goods that creates jobs, and therefore it kind of jumpstarts the U.S. economy and is that permanent fix that was needed to pull us out of the Great Depression. So you need to understand the Lend-Lease Act in the context of World War II, but you also need to understand its connection to the United States economy, specifically that it pulls us out of the Great Depression. Another thing that we need to emphasize are Executive Orders 9066 and Korematsu versus the United States. And these are directly tied to the Japanese internment camps that are established following, down here I've got a star by it, the attack on Pearl Harbor. So if you remember, what pulls the United States into World War II is when Japan bombs Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941. And there's a quote from this time that says, they awoke the sleeping giant. You know, here comes the United States into this, world war. However, it also triggered a chain of events on the home front within the United States. There was significant backlash against the Japanese Americans, Japanese immigrants, anyone of Japanese ancestry, because people were scared. They felt that perhaps these people with ties to Japan were working from within the United States to further another attack. And so this is not a happy moment in U.S. history. Remember, we have to talk about the good, the bad, and the ugly. And so what happens with Executive Order 9066 is that there is the forced relocation of Japanese Americans into these camps for the duration of the war. And so there are a handful of camps that pop out throughout the Southwest United States and as far east as Arkansas, where these families are forced to go and live for the remainder of the war. Now, these are not in concentration camps like we think of with Adolf Hitler. However, these were also camps that did have barbed wire surrounding them and armed guards preventing people from leaving. Now, of course, there's challenges to the legality of these camps. Korematsu versus the United States. However, the Supreme Court upholds the legality of the camps, saying that during times of war, constitutional liberties can be limited. So Executive Order 9066, Korematsu versus the United States, and how they connect to the Japanese internment camps are especially important to know. The GI Bill provides benefits to the World War II veterans after the war. The United Nations is formed. It's one of the big outcomes of World War II, and it remains still the largest international peacekeeping organization in today's times. All right, on the next slide, again, there's just a few that we need to highlight. The War Productions Board and war bonds, those have to do with the American home front and the efforts on the home front to support the war. The Tuskegee Airmen, we need to remind ourselves, So we learned about the Tuskegee Airmen when we studied this unit. And these are a unit of African-American pilots. They trained in Tuskegee, Alabama. That's where they get their name from. And they were kind of an experiment to see, can African-American pilots, excel? And they proved not only would they be good pilots, but that they were excellent pilots. In fact, they were the top pilots. They were highly successful, had a tremendous success rate, and were a big part of America's success in World War II. The remainder of the terms on this page should hopefully stand out to you as ones you remember from our unit. I put a star by D-Day just because of the significance of that battle. That was the turning point in Europe where the Allied forces began to really have successful fight back against Hitler. They went in and they liberated France and started, heading towards Germany from the west. Island hopping was the campaign in the Pacific. The concentration camps and the Holocaust, I know are familiar terms to you. VE Day, VJ Day, the end of the war, and of course the Manhattan Project was that top secret project within the United States to develop the atomic bomb during the war. So again, be familiar with the terms and the people on these 2 pages. If you're not, again, I highly recommend Quizlet as a little study source for you to make some flashcards. Okay, slide 5. So there are so many people involved in World War II, and this is just a fraction of them. So this is how we're going to kind of sort and organize the people and the generals, the leaders, how they were involved in the war. So the first thing you're going to need to do is go through and put in the dates under each of these important battles or events in the war. So you can fill those in, and on this page they do go in chronological order from left to right. So the people on this page, if you look at the next 2 slides on 6 and 7, and I'll highlight some of them in a second, why they were important, what countries they were from, how they contributed to the war, those are defined on the next 2 pages. So please be sure to use those as a reference to learn more about these leaders. If I put little boxes for each leader on the screen, it would be a hot mess at the end and probably of very little value as a study tool to you. So we'll sort them first and then kind of review why these leaders were significant as we go along. Alrighty, here we go. The key people of World War II. Kind of think of this as our World War II Hall of Fame, the people that we are most important for us to understand as the key players in the war. So I'm going to speak about why they're important as we kind of drag them to their right places. But remember, on the next 2 slides, you also have in writing why they're important. So you don't need to feel the need to annotate too much on this slide. We're going to start with the end of the Great Depression. And we can't pinpoint that down to a specific month, date, and year, but we can say it's the early 1940s. Remember, on the previous slides, we talked about the significance of the Lend-Lease Act. So there's 2 people that are important for us to drag to that box. So this, of course, is within the United States. So we're going to be looking for American leaders. So we are going to take President FDR and drag him over. And we are also going to, there's another Roosevelt. We are going to, right there. We're going to drag his wife, Eleanor Roosevelt, as well over to this box. FDR, remember, had the New Deal programs, but also enacting the Lend-Lease Act was highly significant. And if you remember when we studied Eleanor Roosevelt, we talked about how she was kind of a groundbreaker, that she completely revolutionized the role of First Lady within the United States. She was highly active, and that carried over into World War II. She was his boots on the ground and was out visiting troops, but also just highly impactful on the home front, gathering support for the wartime efforts, the Liberty Bonds, the Victory Gardens, and other efforts like that. So they were a true tag team for ending the Great Depression and carrying the United States over into World War II. All right, our next date is December 7th, 1941, with the bombing of Pearl Harbor. So we've already established that the Japanese were the ones that bombed Pearl Harbor. The Japanese admiral that led that attack is Admiral Yamamoto. So we're going to drag his picture up here. He was the, scoot over Yamamoto, there we go. He was the commander of this attack and coordinated all of those efforts. So what would the American counterpart be then? So we are looking for George Marshall. There he is. We're going to drag him over as well. So George Marshall was actually the chief of staff at the White House, and he is going to coordinate the response and the war efforts from Washington, D.C. after the attack on Pearl Harbor. So he was important there. The next date we need to know is April 9th, 1942, the Bataan Death March. And so this takes place in the Philippines, and the commander of the U.S. Army in the Pacific and was highly involved in the Philippines, that is Douglas MacArthur. So we're going to drag him over, let him hang out there. Oops, over. When it was clear that the Japanese were going to conquer the Philippines, MacArthur was given the order to evacuate, and that went against his nature very much. He did not want to leave the people of the Philippines nor the troops. He left behind about 70,000 people. And so he swore, there's this famous oath, that I shall return. And eventually he does return and liberate the Philippines from the Japanese. What takes place in between his leaving and his return is the Bataan Death March. Those 70,000 people that were left behind were captured by the Japanese, and there was a forced march up the peninsula to Bataan. And along the march, the people were not treated very well at all. About 7,000 of them were killed on that march. All right, the turning point in the Pacific is the Battle of Midway from June 3rd to the 7th of 1942. So the leading American commander is Admiral Chester Nimitz. And then the commander for the Japanese is once again Yamamoto. The Americans were successful there. That was the turning point in the Pacific and turns the tide of the war in our favor there. All righty, moving along to the invasion of Italy, September of 1943 to September of 1944. This was the beginning of the Allied invasion of the continent of Europe. It was the soft underbelly of Europe where the defenses from the Axis forces were kind of at their weakest. And so that is where the Allied invasion will begin. So who are they invading against? Well, that would be Benito Mussolini, who was good buddies with Hitler. He was a fascist leader of Italy and rose to popularity there when he promised to restore restore Italy to the glory days of the Roman Empire. And so he is who we're invading against in this. Now, who are the commanding officers that we need to know in this invasion? That would be Bernard Montgomery. He is a British commander. And then we need to know George Patton for the United States. Scooch over, George. There you go. So Mussolini is fighting there for the Axis powers. Montgomery and Patton are leading the Allied forces in. There are two significant heroes that come out of the invasion of Italy. We need to talk about Vernon Baker, who is a highly decorated African-American soldier in the war. He won the Purple Heart, the Bronze Star, and the Distinguished Service Cross. And then lastly is Audie Murphy. He is the war hero of World War II. He was the most highly decorated, American soldier in the war, and he just happens to be a Texas boy. He's from Texas, and after the war, he has a successful career as a movie star. All right, D-Day, the turning point in World War II in Europe, the greatest land invasion in the history of the world, June 6th, 1944. So who are we fighting against? Well, Hitler was not the leader of France, but at that point, France was under Nazi control. And so we have Hitler, and we have his top commander, Erwin Rommel, also known as the Desert Fox. He had led a lot of the fighting in Northern Africa as well. And so you have Hitler and Rommel there. And then who were the Allied commanders of that day? Well, once again, we're going to look at, not once again, we haven't talked about him yet, but Omar Bradley for the Americans. He also fought in Northern Africa, and George Patton is going to, no, not George Patton, just kidding. Dwight Eisenhower, sorry, y'all. Dwight Eisenhower is Just want to make sure y'all are paying attention. All right, Dwight Eisenhower was the commander. He's also going to be significant later on here as well, and future presidents. All right, the Yalta Conference. This is going to be 3 leaders that come together to discuss the plans for the end of the war. That is going to be Joseph Stalin, the leader of the Soviet Union. Remember that we worked with him mainly because we had a common enemy. So FDR is going to be there too. Wasn't so much that we liked Stalin, it was just we both were against Hitler. Stalin was a very cruel leader in his own right, and also treated the Soviet people horribly. Many people were killed within his own country as well. So you had Stalin, Roosevelt, and then you also had Winston Churchill, the Prime Minister of Great Britain, come together at the Yalta Conference. I do want to add one box. These guys together, anytime they got together, had a little nickname. They were known as the Big Three. And at Yalta, they're going to talk about their plans for the end of the war. How are we going to wrap this up? What are we going to do after the war? Just kind of making sure they were all on the same page. Now, as the war comes to a close and they are liberating, countries throughout Europe, they make the horrible discovery of the concentration camps. And so there are 2 leaders, both Patton and Eisenhower, who were leading the liberation of the camps as they freed areas from Nazi control. All right, the dropping of the atomic bomb on Japan. Remember, we dropped 2 atomic bombs on Japan, August 6th and August 9th, Little Boy and Fat Man. Remember, this was the result of the top secret Manhattan Project. And the president who had to make that decision to use those bombs was Harry Truman. Remember, FDR had passed away. Truman was FDR's vice president, and so he becomes the one who has to take on that responsibility and make that call. It was a very hard decision, but ultimately it was seen as saving lives, because to have a land invasion of Japan would have cost millions of lives on both sides. And then finally, the ratification of the 22nd Amendment. If you've been studying your amendments, you should remember, keep your 2's together. 2 2's equals 2 terms. After FDR is when we pass this amendment. And so just remember that FDR had been elected to 4 terms in office. And so he is the only president to ever serve more than 2 terms. But afterwards, they passed the 22nd Amendment that prevents that from happening in the future. All right, like I said earlier, slides 6 and 7 are going to give you the definitions for all of the people that we saw up here on slide 5. Vernon Baker, Dwight Eisenhower, MacArthur, Nimitz, you can see all of them. Now, I've put 2 stars here by the Flying Tigers and the Navajo Code Talkers. Both of these are highly significant groups of people that have a high likelihood of popping up on the STAR test. So the Flying Tigers were Americans who volunteered to go and serve with the Chinese Air Force against Japan prior to America entering the war. It was another reason why Japan was not happy with us leading up to the attack on Pearl Harbor. So our pilots went over, and even though we weren't actively in the war as the United States, they assisted the Chinese Air Force. The Navajo Code Talkers were groups of Navajo men, Native American men, who were recruited by the military to create a code. And this remains the only unbroken military code. And it was highly successful during World War II, especially in the Pacific, as far as relaying messages back and forth and keeping all of our communications safe from Japanese intelligence. So the contributions of the Navajo Code Talkers, again, was highly significant during World War II. On slide 7, again, you have Vernon Baker, our highly decorated war veteran, Audie Murphy, another highly decorated war veteran, and then the leaders during World War II: Hitler, Mussolini, Stalin, Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt, Winston Churchill, and Harry Truman. So you have good little summaries of their contributions. Again, you need to make time to review this material and make sure you have them all sorted out before the STAR test. All right, for the Cold War, we are going to kind of transition. Remember, the Cold War begins almost as soon as World War II ends, and it's this time of competition, conflict, high tensions between the Soviet Union and the United States. Now, there are two proxy wars. The two countries never fight themselves directly, hence the reason why it's called the Cold War, but there are two wars that are a part of the Cold War. You have the Korean War in the early 1950s, and you have the Vietnam conflict from roughly the mid-1960s to the mid-1970s. Those are going to be the two proxy wars during the Cold War. All right, let's dive into the key vocabulary about the Cold War. Now remember, slides 8, 9, and 10, all of these terms and people are fair game for the STAR test. You should be familiar with all of them. So again, however it works best for you to go back and review these terms, flashcards, lists, whatever works best in your brain, you need to be familiar with all of them. But we are going to emphasize some of the ones that you are most likely to see on the STAR test. So once again, we have the key definition of the Cold War that we just went over. And then I highlighted these next three terms: containment, the Truman Doctrine, and the Marshall Plan. So these three all are of the same idea. It's America's plan to contain communism. How are we going to contain communism? How are we going to keep it from spreading? That word containment is that key one. That's the force behind all of our foreign policy decisions during the Cold War. How are we going to contain it? How are we going to keep it from spreading and other countries becoming communist? Now, Truman is the first president of the Cold War era, immediately after World War II, and he issues the Truman Doctrine, which is basically announcing to the world, hey, if you need support, if your country is trying to fight communism, we will come and help you, right? Kind of tell my kids, it's like instead of the Ghostbusters, we're the Communist Busters. Like, who are you going to call? Communist Busters. Like, here comes the United States. And so he makes that announcement to the world. The Marshall Plan was an economic plan to help the European countries rebuild after World War II so that they were strong enough to resist communism. So America is going to provide economic aid to help those countries rebuild. Now, Stalin's going to come in and kind of say no for all of Eastern Europe, like they don't want your money, but Western Europe definitely is benefited by the Marshall Plan. Okay, the Berlin Airlift. This is a key event and one of the first standoffs of the Cold War era. Stalin comes in and blockades West Berlin from East Berlin. Remember that between Germany and France, the United States and Great Britain, they had kind of cordoned off Germany and Berlin into sections that each country got to be in charge of. And so the Soviets are going to block off East Berlin from West Berlin because they were in charge of East Berlin and they wanted the whole city. He was kind of like, I should have the whole thing, Stalin said. So he cuts them off from all supplies, shipments, and is going to kind of basically, have a standoff. Like, I'm going to starve out these people if you don't give me the whole city. The response from the Americans, with help by the British, is the Berlin Airlift, where for over a year, we fly over Berlin and drop out of the planes, with little parachutes attached to these boxes, coal and flour and meat and paper goods, day after day after day after day for over a year. So everything that the people in Berlin needed to survive off of came from these airdrops. And finally, Stalin realized, okay, fine, whatever, I'm not going to win this, and backs off. So this was kind of an early victory for America and Britain in this first standoff. You have HUAC and McCarthyism that have to deal with investigations into communists being in the United States. During the Cold War, there was a great fear. We have the Red Scare Part 2, that there were communists trying to overtake America from within. So those terms have to do with that. NATO, that's another one that you would definitely want to know. It stands for the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, and it was basically an alliance system between the United States, Canada, and most of Western Europe that they would defend each other if they were attacked. Kind of a standoff, like, hey, Soviet Union, if you mess with one of us, you're messing with all of us. The space race was another key part of the Cold War. It was kind of kicked off when the Soviet Union launched Sputnik up into space, but culminated with the United States landing on the moon. So the USA wins the space race. We were behind for most of it, but we finished when it counted. We got man on the moon first, and we won the space race. Another key term to know is the domino theory. This was the belief that if one country fell to communism, the ones all around it would also fall to communism, much like a string of dominoes lined up. If you push the first one over, then they all fall down. So this is important because this is basically our justification for involvement in Vietnam. This is why under Kennedy, we start sending advisors over and kind of everything escalates to our full involvement that we see. But the domino theory was that justification why we were focused on Southeast Asia and why Vietnam was so important for us to keep from falling to communism. Another key event to remember is the Cuban Missile Crisis and JFK's role in that. Remember, Cuba is there just 90 miles off the south coast of Florida. And when our U-2 spy planes were zooming around, they captured these images of the nuclear missiles, the warheads there in Cuba pointed at the United States, which led to all-out panic in the United States government in trying to get these missiles removed without beginning nuclear war. Now, we said that during the Cold War, we never fight the Soviet Union. The Cuban Missile Crisis is the closest we came to actual war between the United States and the Soviet Union. This was 13 days in October of 1962. We were literally on the brink. And thankfully, cooler heads prevailed. JFK initiated a blockade of Cuba and then basically prevented nuclear war from happening. Between JFK and Nikita Khrushchev, they were able to work things out and avoid total war. The Gulf of Tonkin resolution is involved with Vietnam, as well as the escalation of troops. All right. The second page of vocabulary, you have the draft. This time it is specific to Vietnam. The one connection I wanted y'all to make was to the 26th Amendment, that you're old enough to fight, old enough to vote. This lowers the voting age from 21 to 18, and it was in direct response to the draft. Remember, the draft was highly unpopular amongst most of the American home front. Most people were not supporting the war by that point and were not in favor of the draft as well. So the voting age was lowered from 21 to 18 to match the draft age. Pentagon Papers were part of the continued disillusionment between the American people and trusting the American government. Vietnamization was Nixon's strategy in the war. The War Powers Act, this was that blank check given to LBJ basically to do whatever he needed to do in order to retaliate to the Gulf of Tonkin incidents, and led to, wrong. All right, carrying on with our key terms, the domino theory is also extremely important. It was that belief that if one country falls to communism, then all the surrounding countries would also fall to communism as well. Much like a string of dominoes lined up, if you push the first one over, they all fall down. What you need to remember about the domino theory, this was our justification for involvement in Vietnam. Why we felt like it was so critical to saving Vietnam from communism, because if Vietnam fell, then all of the surrounding countries would as well. All right, another star goes to the Cuban Missile Crisis and JFK's role in it. During the Cold War, remember we've said that the United States and Soviet Union never had all-out war. Well, the Cuban Missile Crisis was the closest we came to that, and thankfully it did not result in war. Remember, Cuba is just 90 miles off the south coast of Florida, and our spy planes detected nuclear warheads on the island of Cuba, put there by the Soviet Union, and they could hit the majority of the U.S. eastern coast and eastern countries. And so when this was discovered and brought to JFK's attention, it led to a crisis in our government of how do we get these missiles out of Cuba without going to war. And so for 13 days in October of 1962, we were on the brink of that. And everything had to be phrased carefully, negotiated carefully, and tried to work out. There was a naval quarantine placed around Cuba to prevent more weapons from coming in. And thankfully, through diplomacy, there was a resolution reached where Soviet Union removed those missiles, and then later on the United States removed some missiles from Turkey, and all-out war was avoided. But for those days, those 13 days, things really could have flipped on a dime either way. So it's important to remember the Cuban Missile Crisis. The Gulf of Tonkin resolution has to do with Vietnam. That is when Congress gave authority to Johnson to really kind of have full military powers to respond in Vietnam after the Gulf of Tonkin incident and the ensuing troop escalation that came under Johnson's presidency. On the next slide, we are going to talk about the draft during Vietnam. And I want you to make the connection to the 26th Amendment. A lot of you have kind of remembered this phrase: if you're old enough to fight, you're old enough to vote. The draft was not highly popular during Vietnam. As support for the war faded, so did support for the draft. And because the draft age was 18, people felt like that should also be the voting age, so that you would have a say in the policies that determined if you were going to be drafted or not. The Pentagon Papers, Vietnamization, that all has to do with Nixon. Pentagon Papers kind of furthered America's distrust of the government. This was Nixon's policy of turning the fighting over to the Vietnamese people. And one of the big outcomes of the Vietnam conflict is that Wars Powers Act that says, no more can the president just have a blank check to do what he needs to do militarily, that you have 60 days to deploy troops, and after that you have to have congressional approval or the troops come home. Now, we have some stars coming up, some terms that you need to make sure you understand. The credibility gap was highly important, especially during Johnson's presidency and Vietnam. It was that difference between what people could clearly see on TV every night and what President Johnson was saying as far as the progress in the war. Johnson's like, we're winning, but the reporting of the war was clearly showing otherwise. The anti-war movement, the peace movement, the campus shutdowns and sit-ins, the Kent State massacre, all of those are important to remember. The baby boom, that from the 40s to the 60s, there was this huge spike in birth rates after World War II, where people were kind of just like happy and just celebrating and enjoying life. And it led to a huge population increase. Y'all, I think, refer to them as boomers nowadays. We also have the GI Bill, which was the benefits to the troops after World War II as far as education, job training, mortgages, and all of that. And then the silent majority, where Nixon was like, no, America still supports the war, they're just silent. You know, that's what he believed anyways. And again, all of these terms can pop up on the test, but as I was saying, be familiar with all of these terms. You've got Korea down here also, that first proxy war between North and South Korea, where the United States came in to support South Korea. On the next slide, you have three key people: JFK, Joseph McCarthy, and Roy Benavidez, who was one of the war heroes of the Vietnam War. All right, the next slide has political cartoons on it, and I am going to turn it over to your classroom teacher. So they will help you analyze these political cartoons to review the Cold War.